Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. We have received some feedback, which we appreciate, but we would definitely like more thoughts on what you would like to learn about or topics you'd like us to cover. Anything you're interested in having to do with gardening or lighting in your garden, just shoot us an email at podcast@blackdogled.com. That's PODCAST at blackdogled.com. This will allow us to make sure we cover the topics you care about. Again, that's podcast@blackdogled.com. So today we're going to cover what we consider to be a marketing term. Often people think it is a scientific term or it actually has meaning or something specific associated with it, but it really is somewhat of a vague marketing term. And unfortunately, people are putting a lot of credence in it, and that is full spectrum. So full spectrum is often used to denote a white spectrum in today's world. What they are saying is by not using targeted LEDs, you're getting a full spectrum. You're covering the full spectrum. There's a little bit of truth to that, but it is still misleading. And we hear about it so much. We see it so much in marketing papers and in advertisements for LED grow lights. We thought it was worth diving into a little bit and explaining some of it so that people had a better understanding of really what that term means or doesn't mean.
Yeah, and full spectrum is typically used in the lighting industry to denote a light which provides the full spectrum that human eyes can see. So as long as it provides all of the colors that we can see, which is from blue through red, including green and yellow in the middle, then they call it full spectrum. But the actual spectrum of the light itself can differ quite a bit between different sources. And of course, just because it includes all the colors that humans can see doesn't mean it's truly full spectrum in terms of what plants want.
And as Kevin said, it's key there to listen to what he's saying about that's generally how it's used. There is no set definition. That's the key part, the key takeaway from this regarding full spectrum is you can't just read full spectrum and assume there's some honesty or marketing honesty or some kind of specification that goes along with that. It is just a branding term or a marketing term used by different manufacturers. As Kevin said, it's used frequently in architectural lighting for your home or for an office, but now they're using it for growing plants. And as Kevin pointed out, it is not necessarily the same thing.
Well, they're just taking the same LEDs, which are marked as full spectrum for human use, and saying, oh, it's full spectrum, and so we can grow plants with them too. And of course, it's not that they don't grow plants, but they're not truly full spectrum in terms of what plants actually want.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about that they are used for humans and why that is somewhat of an accurate term to be used for those white lights in architectural lighting or for human eye use. And that's if you think of spectrum as a rainbow going from left to right, we're going from blue all the way to red. We've all seen the red rainbow. Some of you might remember from science class, Roy G. Biv, to remember our colors in the rainbow. But as far as the humans see, what we see is we don't see UV. We start seeing it the kind of the deep blue range, and then we go to near infrared or kind of the far edge of the red spectrum. And yes, a white light, a well-designed white light, will be a continuous spectrum at different levels and intensities, but it will be a continuous spectrum from the reds to the blues or blues to reds, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, the difference is some of the LEDs you're used to seeing, whether they're on a warning light on your router or on your phone or something, they're often red or green LEDs. Those are obviously not full spectrum. Those are a targeted wavelength. And that's primarily what we use in our lights, but we do use white to fill in certain areas. But what they're saying is they're using these white LEDs in their grow lights, and they're calling that full spectrum because it's more of what I would call a continuous spectrum across the visible wavelengths, not full.
But one thing to note is it's not continuous as in flat across the spectrum. In fact, the human eye is actually very bad at picking out where lights can be deficient in some colors more than others. And with most so-called full spectrum LEDs, there's a big peak in the blue area of the spectrum. And then again, where the human eye is most sensitive in the green and yellow area of the spectrum, but it's actually got very little in between, even though it is somewhat a continuous spectrum there between the blue and the greenish yellow. It really isn't as strong there as it is especially in the green and yellow area of the spectrum where the human eye is most sensitive. Also falls off typically quite extensively towards the red, and it has absolutely nothing in the deep blue area of the spectrum.
So if we look at the original LED grow lights, I go back to the very first one I ever used growing many years ago. It was simply red and blue, maybe a couple colors of red and a couple blues. And that, I think, is what they're trying to kind of argue against when they talk about full spectrum, that it's not just red and blue, they're including other things. And I won't argue that at all. And so red and blue is interesting. And yes, that's the dominant parts we want, and that's what plants want. But we do want to fill in the other areas, and we do believe in that. However, as Kevin said, you need to look at the balance of the colors coming out of these white LEDs or the spectrum you're getting out of your entire grow light. So when they went, back in the day, they were all red and blue, and then a lot of guys now are running only white LEDs across their entire light, maybe adding a few reds in, as Kevin pointed out. Often the whites are deficient in the red, and we need that for flowering and for proper plant development. But going to these full spectrum has some benefits. Having whites in there has benefits. It's why we include them. However, if we look at what plants need, as Kevin was just talking about, there's other areas we really should be focusing on with targeted wavelengths. And we feel using the whites to balance out your spectrum is a more appropriate use of those whites.
Well, and then also the whites are actually completely lacking in everything shorter wavelength, basically, than 450 or 440 nanometers. So they're missing everything in the deep blue area of the spectrum as well as ultraviolet. And a lot of lights these days are being marketed by their CRI, or Colored Rendition Index, which is a term which describes how perfectly that light replicates how human eyes perceive it to be similar to sunlight. So a CRI of 80 means that 80% of all of the natural colors you would see in a picture or a scene are going to come across as being the correct color under that light source, compared to a CRI of 100 if you're outside in the sunlight, meaning that you would see that picture, that color wheel, for example, with all of those colors in natural sunlight, and that is the most perfect. So that's a color rendition index of 100. CRI is very useful in terms of getting an idea of how complete and how filled in that spectrum is, that complete or full spectrum is. However, it's very important to note that's only defined in terms of how the human eye perceives it. So as long as there's enough yellow and green in there, you can actually get a decent CRI out of a light, a decent color rendition index, even though it's still fairly deficient in red and incredibly deficient in deep blue, because our human eyes are not as good at seeing those colors.
Yeah, and Kevin, that's a great point. As long as we're talking about that and looking at how the CRI, and as you're saying, sunlight, when we talk about full spectrum, a lot of these companies say it's really closer to natural sun or to a natural sunlight. And in fact, the natural sun is not the ideal growing medium for growing with plants. Can you talk a little bit about the difference of why full spectrum and sunlight isn't necessarily the most ideal to reproduce artificially?
Well, that's where they're confusing the color rendition index in terms of how closely it mimics how the human eye perceives it compared to natural sunlight, with how close the spectrum actually is to what the sun puts out. If you look at the sun's actual spectrum compared to a spectral graph for some of these high CRI white LEDs or full spectrum LEDs, it's dramatically different. And so they can say, because in architectural use, they can say that it is replicating the sun spectrum as far as how the human eye perceives it. So if you have a CRI of 98 from an LED, that means that it's 98% as good as the sun at replicating natural sunlight. So while a high CRI on a white or phosphor converted or full spectrum LED, whatever you want to call them, means that it's very good for architectural use and very good for how the human eye perceives it. And it does mean that it is similar as far as how the human eye perceives it to natural sunlight. It does not in any way mean that it is close to replicating the sun's actual spectrum, only in how the human eye perceives it. So a high CRI LED can still be very much lacking in the red and can be completely lacking in the deep blue area of the spectrum, can be completely lacking the ultraviolet and infrared light that plants actually want and utilize, and still be marketed not inappropriately in the architectural space as replicating the sun's natural spectrum. So a lot of these marketing terms that are appropriate for architectural or indoor uses of lights for human needs are then reapplied to marketing grow lights. And they say, oh, it's a full spectrum LED and it replicates the sun's natural spectrum. Well, it doesn't, especially not as far as how plants are concerned and what plants actually want. So there's a lot of companies out there that are even making fun of LED grow lights that actually use targeted spectrum, saying that they're not full spectrum, when actually if you look at the actual spectral graphs, the so-called full spectrum light is not actually as complete as the targeted spectrum lighting that can be provided from combinations of discrete color LEDs, along with some white phosphor converted LEDs in there as well.
Excellent. So, out of curiosity, if we look at our light, at the Phytomax 2 with the phytogenesis spectrum, we do use some whites in there. We've got our targeted LEDs you're talking about, the ones that are going to be targeted for reds, blues, the deep blues, the UV, but we're still using whites. Why exactly, when we have the ability to pull in all these different, we could actually just put yellow and green LEDs into our light to fill in the yellow and green. How come we don't go with those specifically?
And that's basically down to a technical reason. So it has to do with the efficiency of different LEDs. There's basically two very efficient LED colors available on the market right now. A lot of research has been done to make these particular colors as efficient as possible because they're the most commonly used LEDs in the world. And that is a blue LED and a red LED. And you might think that that's kind of funny given that our eyes are most sensitive to yellow and green. Why aren't we looking at making yellow and green LEDs more efficient for humans? And the answer is because if you can take a blue LED and put a phosphor coating on top, that phosphor coating is used to steal some energy from the blue photons and essentially smear them out into other colors in the spectrum, primarily yellow and green. But by doing this, you can actually get a light that has what they call a full spectrum, has blue light in it, has yellow light, a lot of green light in it as well to make it more efficient for human eyes. And that phosphor actually smears some of the photons out into the orange and red area of the spectrum as well, so that it provides a complete full spectrum as far as what our eyes need from a single LED. And therefore, by making blue LEDs really efficient and just putting this phosphor layer on top, you can make a very efficient LED light for human use. Now, it doesn't cover the red area of the spectrum as much as plants want, but it covers it well enough for human eyes, and that's what these things are being designed for. They're not being designed for plant growth. They're being designed for use in offices and architectural lighting. So we could be using a discrete color spectrum, for example, a yellow or a green LED, but it turns out that those green LEDs are woefully inefficient compared to the blue. And it's actually more efficient at this point in time to create yellow light by actually using a blue LED and putting this phosphor layer on top. You can get more yellow photons that way than going with a pure yellow LED, just because the research hasn't been put into those to actually make them efficient. The reason why red LEDs are so common and are efficient on the market is, one, they were actually the first color of LED that was really designed for use that was within the human visual spectrum. So those of you that are old enough may remember in the 1970s when LEDs started appearing in consumer products such as watches. The only color LEDs available back then were red. So if you bought an LED alarm clock, it had red digits on the face of the clock. There were no green LEDs back then. There were no blue LEDs. In fact, it wasn't until 2002 that they actually invented a blue LED that was efficient enough to actually use, and that one actually won the Nobel Prize. So it wasn't until 2002 that we actually even had the blue LEDs. They've been playing around with red LEDs for a very long time before that, and it turns out red LEDs are used extensively in our culture in tail lights and stop lights. And that is actually the main application, the main market market for red LEDs is not plant grow lights at the moment, although that's changing quickly. But right now, most red LEDs are going into taillights and stoplights as they're being replaced around the country.
So it sounds like the whites could definitely do the same thing as a targeted green or yellow, but the reason we go with the whites today is the efficiency question, which is the other side of the coin. You know, we're focused on two things, and that's going to be the spectrum and the efficiency, because it doesn't do us any good if we throw some colors in there that are completely inefficient to produce. And that, of course, takes our yields down. And when we look at it as a kind of watts and a grams per watt yield type of situation. So what you're saying is we're going with the whites to fill in those green and blue areas, or sorry, green and yellow areas, because it's much more efficient to produce that light, even though they're both going to produce the same wavelengths in theory at the end of the day if balanced properly.
Yeah, we get the question actually all the time of what colors of LEDs are we using and what ratio are we using them in, because some LED lights are marketing themselves saying, oh, we're using 4 blues to 7 reds in our light. And that may be relevant information if you're looking at a very specific set of LEDs. But because of the different efficiencies of different LEDs on the market, there's actually multiple different ways that you can use different discrete color LEDs or these phosphor converted white LEDs to actually create the same spectrum with vastly different kinds of LEDs. And so it's kind of meaningless when people ask us, oh, well, what ratio of LEDs are you using? Well, that actually changes. We've had basically the same spectrum in every one of our lights over the past 8.5 years now. And we've made that same spectrum with very different combinations of LEDs over time. As technology keeps changing and certain varieties of LEDs get more efficient than others, we can create the same spectrum more efficiently by changing out exactly what ratio of LEDs we're using. And even now, as we are incorporating continuously the improvements in LED technology in our lights as we're building them, the ratio of different colors that we use has to change. As the blues get a little bit more efficient, then we might need to actually increase the number of reds that we're using relative to the blues. And then the reds get a little bit more efficient and it goes back again. So we're constantly changing that, using different types of LEDs to achieve the spectrum we want. So rather than just saying, oh, it's full spectrum and it's got a high CRI, we are actually trying very hard to get a spectrum which is complete all the way from ultraviolet through infrared. And we're not just making a spectrum that is complete from ultraviolet through infrared. We're doing it with very specific levels of red, ratios of red to blue light in the spectrum. Not ratios of LEDs, but ratios of the actual level of light in the spectrum. That's what's important. That's what we target. And it turns out that whereas, 8 years ago when we first started, to get enough green in the spectrum, we actually did have to incorporate actual green LEDs in there. Now that the phosphor converted white full spectrum LEDs are so much better at that, it's far more efficient to use those to fill in that area of the spectrum.
Interesting. So if we talk about real quick, it's getting back to just the full spectrum claim. So what I'm understanding from what you're saying about us covering from UV all the way from UV to IR is we're really more of a true full spectrum. And obviously, we moved away from that a long time ago because we think the name or the term full spectrum is just overused and it doesn't really have any meaning. So we've switched to beyond par because par is going to really encompass what they initially thought was used by the plant and what they thought the plant's photosynthesis was limited to using. And now, of course, there's much research showing that there are benefits to going both into the far red and infrared as well as down into the UV range. So we use beyond par for our marketing and talking about our spectrum. Do you think that's a more accurate representation than saying full spectrum, or are they really beyond par and full spectrum the same thing?
Well, so full spectrum is such a loaded, misleading term. I mean, if we wanted to actually replicate the actual spectrum of sunlight, first the question becomes, where do you want to replicate that? If you go up in space above the Earth's atmosphere, the sun is actually putting out stuff in the UVC area of the spectrum, which is what is used here on Earth as sterilizing radiation. It's the sort of thing that they turn on in an operating room when no one's in there to sterilize all the surfaces. Now, there are even people that are marketing UVC lights for use on plants, saying that it will help sterilize things like powdery mildew on your leaves, and it absolutely will. Of course, it'll help sterilize your leaves too in terms of killing them, but that's a separate question. So we don't want to replicate that. And even if we look at the sun spectrum that actually makes it down to the surface of the Earth here, it actually has a huge amount of infrared. That's why the sun feels warm to us. One of the reasons the sun feels warm to us when we're in full sunlight. And there's a lot of infrared in the spectrum. And a lot of animals even can see infrared light because it's actually useful. There's a lot of infrared light coming down from the sun. We can't see it. And it turns out plants only use a very small portion of that as far as we know. So we don't replicate. We don't bother wasting energy on some of the far red, not the far red, but the further infrared. It's still technically called near infrared if it's less than 1,000 nanometers. But plants really don't use anything above 750 nanometers. So we don't bother including those colors in our spectrum of infrared light, even though the sun, natural sunlight, does contain those. It's kind of inefficient for us to be putting those in our light because plants aren't using them.
Gotcha. So if we look at that and we say there are areas of the spectrum that we don't want to replicate for the reasons you pointed out, what we're doing is we're focusing on the areas that, one, are not easy to reproduce but are efficient with today's technology, and two, the ones we feel are most useful for the plants and growing them. And when we talk about growing them, are we just talking about actual, let's say, flower production? We're looking at full spectrum, or are we looking at other things, maybe plant morphology and things like that?
Yes, so that's one of the key takeaway differences between the so-called full spectrum LEDs, the marketing term, and then an actual spectrum which is complete as far as plants are concerned. When you have the full spectrum white LEDs that you can buy from Home Depot, they actually have enough of the different colors in the spectrum that they will actually grow plants, and they will grow plants pretty well. Now, that just means that a plant will actually grow underneath them. It's not going to die. It's not going to wither away, and it might even look healthy. But if you take a close look at the plant, you'll notice that it doesn't grow the same way that it would under natural sunlight. And a lot of that is because these so-called full spectrum white LEDs are mostly putting out light in the yellow and green area of the spectrum, where plants are least efficient at actually picking it up and utilizing it. And so they're kind of lacking in terms of the red and blue. Now, there's enough red and blue in there that the plants are going to grow, but they're going to be dealing with some different hormonal responses due to the lack of red and blue light. In our phytogenesis spectrum, we actually put red and blue and even different wavelengths of red in very specific ratios so that we can control the hormones that the plant is expressing to control how it actually grows, control the plant morphology. We do that to discourage internodal stem spacing and keep those internodal spaces as tight as possible, because we're trying to encourage the plant not to waste energy on growing lots of stems, but instead to grow more leaves and flowers. That's what we want.
And so internodal spacing, for those of you that have been growing cannabis a long time, you'd know that as stretching. So what we're trying to do is eliminate or reduce the stretching as much as possible and put more of that energy towards flower production. So that is interesting. So the different colors are going to do different things, of course, in a full spectrum. One full spectrum light compared to another quote unquote full spectrum light could have a very different effect on your plant depending on the actual blend, because again, full spectrum doesn't tell you what that blend is. It doesn't denote anything other than they're using something they consider to be quote unquote full spectrum. But one full spectrum light compared to another would have maybe very different effects on your garden and your plants.
Absolutely. And so if you take a look at the actual spectrum graphs, I think anyone would say that the phytogenesis spectrum we use is a full spectrum. It's certainly more complete than the so-called full spectrum white LEDs in that we actually have deep blue and ultraviolet as well as near infrared in our spectrum, well outside the range of the normal phosphor converted white LEDs. But ours is actually going to grow plants much better and much differently than the so-called full spectrum white LEDs, because we're targeting specific hormonal responses in the plants as well as targeting the wavelengths which plants use most efficiently. So that's one of the reasons why we have the change in terms of the ambient temperature you need to run in your room. It's because with our spectrum, we're targeting what the plants most efficiently absorb and utilize utilize, and that means it's not heating their leaves up as much. So these so-called full spectrum white LEDs, because it's mostly yellow light, which plants can use for photosynthesis, but just not as efficiently, you actually have to keep your ambient temperature in the room lower to keep the plants themselves, the plant's leaves, at the same temperature that you would with an equal amount of light from our spectrum. Because our spectrum is more efficiently targeting the chloroplasts in those plants, it's not heating their leaves up as much. So there's a lot of differences, not just hormonal responses and how your plant grows, but also what temperature you can grow at. And as we all know, the warmer you can run your grow room, the less you need to cool it. And that ends up saving you a lot of money. Cooling tends to be a very expensive portion of the growing budget.
Yeah, and we've seen commercially, because of that change, you're talking about up to 60% savings on HVAC when compared to a traditional HPS spectrum and the temperatures associated with growing under HPS. So the 60%, 60, is obviously a huge chunk of money, especially when you're talking about a commercial-sized operation for growing indoors.
Yeah, so we're not saying that these full spectrum white LEDs won't grow plants. They grow plants, and they grow plants actually much better than, for example, a fluorescent light, because the spectrum is actually more complete with the white LEDs than it is with what appears to be white light coming out of a fluorescent tube. So white LEDs are definitely a big step up in terms of plant growing compared to a lot of the other technologies on the market out there. But just because they happen to work better doesn't mean that they are the end-all be-all. We can actually do a lot better if we actually target the spectral areas that plants really want.
So if you take your science hat off, Kevin, and I ask you this question, what would you think if I said, would you consider, with the way they're using full spectrum today as a marketing term, would you consider HPS a full spectrum?
I mean, technically, if you look at the spectrum graph, I could make the argument that it is a complete full spectrum. And one of the reasons why high-pressure sodium lights were so widely deployed in parking lots and street lights around the world is because it is a complete enough, a full enough spectrum that human eyes can actually get decent color vision underneath it. The color rendition index on it is actually pretty poor, but it's not zero. I actually don't know what it is off the top of my head, but I believe it's somewhere around 60 for a high pressure sodium light for the color rendition index. So it is a full spectrum in that you can see all of the colors of the rainbow if they're put on a color wheel in front of you and underneath a high pressure sodium bulb. But it's certainly not as full a spectrum as the white phosphor converted LEDs.
Gotcha. I was just curious. I mean, because again, the term is being used so generically nowadays that my point there was you could apply it to, you could apply it to T5s, you could apply it to metal halides, you could apply it to HPS, because again, it's a continuous spectrum and that's all they're really kind of speaking towards, but they're not. The problem with full spectrum is it doesn't tell you anything about the light's ability to grow plants and the light's ability to grow plants well and efficiently. So the whole point of this discussion was really to look at these marketing terms that we feel are actually sort of bad for our industry because we feel they're just general marketing terms. They have no science behind them. They don't mean anything. They're just a sales term. And so we feel that people would be better off understanding a little bit more about what PPF is, PPFD, what PAR is, understanding what Kevin was talking about earlier with regards to blue and deep blues and reds and the ratios there. And yes, it gets pretty deep and pretty scientific quickly, but at least understanding a little bit so that you don't just get taken advantage of by these kind of flashy marketing terms that really don't mean anything other than somebody in a marketing, department decided to go ahead and use that term. It has no scientific meaning and no meaning to true plant enthusiasts that really want to know the science behind why their light is working or isn't working or growing the plants the way they want or not growing the plants they want. We've talked about how HPS, and Kevin touched on it, will cause your plant to stretch. Yes, it will flower, but the stretch is completely unnecessary, and that just comes down to the science behind the light and the spectrum. So you can go back and listen to some of our previous podcasts about that. But so the point here is that there are a lot of terms being used in selling LED grow lights today. There's a lot of marketing being used, overstating wattages. But one that we see time and time again constantly is this move towards kind of the full spectrum terminology. And we just want to make it clear that that really doesn't mean anything. And it's not saying if a light says it's full spectrum, it's a bad light, but you really need to dive in a little deeper and see why they're calling it full spectrum and really what that spectrum consists of.
Yeah, and to be clear, So we're trying to say here today that there is no definition of what full spectrum is, and so therefore it's kind of a meaningless marketing term. But we don't mean that to say that we are believing that a LED grow light that consists only of red and blue does good either. There's a reason why we incorporate every color in the rainbow, as well as colors outside of what human eyes can see, in our phytogenesis spectrum, because it grows plants better to have all of those colors of light in there. So we're not focused on just red and blue or 4 or 5 colors. We are covering a complete true full spectrum, but again, the term full spectrum is not defined and therefore kind of meaningless.
So that's a good point. So in our terminology, even though we don't use it because we don't believe in the term, by anyone's standard today, our light would qualify as quote unquote full spectrum. We just don't believe in that as a term to use to describe the light because it's really not describing much. So in any case there, what we do is we wanted to just go over this with you, with our listeners, because we do get questions about, is your light full spectrum? What is full spectrum? We see a lot of marketing terms, a lot of this being thrown around, and we just wanted to take a minute to define it and speak a little bit to what it means and what it doesn't mean. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this installment of the Cultivation Cast. Again, if you have any questions about the content or have ideas for future topics such as full spectrum or anything you want us to explore a little deeper and explain in depth, please go ahead and send an email to podcast, that's podcast, at blackdogled.com. Thanks again for joining us, and happy gardening, everyone.